My name is Savannah, and at 35 years old, I am the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Equity. But 20 years ago, my own parents threw me out onto the street with $200 in my pocket because I was the ugly and socially awkward teenager who embarrassed their perfect country club image. They stole my entire college fund to buy a business for my golden child brother Cameron. Last night at a high society charity gala in Chicago, Cameron snatched my bidding paddle and ordered security to throw me out, calling me a pathetic interloper. He had no idea that I had just bid $250,000 in cash, or that my bank held the mortgage to his entire life. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled the toxic family that discarded me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, my family worshipped at the altar of appearances. My parents, Richard and Barbara, cared only about status, wealth, and looking flawless to their wealthy neighbors. My older brother Cameron fit their mold perfectly. He was the handsome, charismatic quarterback who charmed everyone he met. I was the exact opposite. I was a quiet, awkward girl with thick glasses braces and a love for reading financial textbooks instead of fashion magazines. To my parents, my lack of social grace was a personal insult to their carefully curated image. They hid me away when guests came over and constantly reminded me that I was the family disappointment. The breaking point happened on the day of my high school graduation. I had graduated as valedictorian at 15 years old, skipping 3 grades due to my academic dedication. But instead of being proud, my mother was horrified by my appearance on stage. When we got home, she packed a single suitcase, threw $200 at me, and told me I was dead to them. They emptied the college fund my grandmother had left me, using the $150,000 to fund Cameron's first logistics startup. I was 15 and completely alone. But I survived. I took that pain and turned it into fuel. Over the next 20 years, I built an empire from the ground up, working relentlessly to become the majority shareholder of a massive private equity firm. I completely reinvented myself. Now I wore custom-tailored emerald gowns and commanded boardrooms across the globe. My family had absolutely no idea. They thought I had died in obscurity long ago. The collision of our two worlds happened on a crisp Saturday evening in November. The Grand Chicago Ballroom was hosting its annual charity auction benefiting local children's hospitals. The room was filled with the city's elite wearing expensive tuxedos and designer dresses dripping in diamonds. I was sitting at a VIP table near the front, sipping sparkling water and observing the crowd. I was there to bid on a vintage diamond and sapphire necklace that had caught my eye. The auctioneer, a charismatic man with a booming voice, opened the bidding for the necklace at $50,000. I raised my paddle, calmly enjoying the thrill of the auction. The price quickly escalated as other wealthy patrons tried to outbid me. When the price hit $150,000, the room grew quiet. It was just me and one other bidder across the room. I raised my paddle again, signaling $175,000. Just as the auctioneer was about to call it, a shadow fell over my table. A hand shot out from behind me, grabbed my numbered bidding paddle, and violently snapped the wooden handle in half. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the immediate area, turning heads at the neighboring tables. I looked up and my heart completely stopped for a fraction of a second. Standing over me with a face twisted in absolute disgust was my older brother Cameron. He looked older, of course, but he still carried that same arrogant entitlement he had 20 years ago. Beside him stood a woman I did not recognize, but who clearly matched his snobby demeanor, radiating condescension. It was his wife, Diana. "Security, get this ugly interloper out of here," Cameron shouted, his voice deliberately loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding elite guests. "She is a high school dropout pretending to be a VIP just to embarrass my family." The humiliation. He expected me to feel the familiar sting of his bullying that used to reduce me to tears simply did not happen. The scared 15-year-old girl he remembered was long gone. In her place sat a woman who routinely destroyed predatory corporations before breakfast. I did not cry. I did not shrink away. I remained perfectly seated, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression entirely unbothered. I smoothly raised my hand, catching the auctioneer's attention with a swift, undeniable gesture. I do not need a paddle, Cameron. I said, my voice calm but cutting clearly through the hushed murmurs of the crowd. I just bid $250,000. Unless your failing logistics company can match that, I suggest you step aside and let the adults handle the charity work. Cameron's face turned a violent shade of purple. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The fact that I not only stood my ground, but knew about his struggling company, left him momentarily paralyzed. Before he could recover, a sharp, grasping hand clamped onto my shoulder from behind. I turned to see my mother, Barbara, pushing her way through the crowd in a gaudy sequined gown. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed, her voice dripping with the same venom that used to haunt my childhood nightmares. "We threw you out 20 years ago because you were a hideous antisocial nerd who embarrassed us at your own high school graduation. How dare you stalk us and spend your waitressing tips just to show off in front of our friends?" The sheer audacity of her statement was breathtaking. She was actually trying to spin a narrative where abandoning a child and stealing her inheritance was somehow justified because I was socially awkward. I calmly removed her hand from my shoulder, brushing the fabric of my dress as if wiping away dirt. "I am not stalking you, Barbara," I replied, refusing to grant her the title of mother. "I am simply attending a charity event. And speaking of waitressing tips, it is fascinating that you bring up money. Tell me, did the $150,000 you stole from my college fund when I was a minor help Cameron build the business he is currently running into the ground?" My father, Richard, finally appeared, pushing his way to the front of our hostile family reunion. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Do not you dare speak to your mother that way, you ungrateful failure. You owe us for putting a roof over your head for 15 years. You are nothing but a pathetic liar trying to ruin your brother's night." Diana, who had been standing beside Cameron with her arms crossed, decided it was her turn to attack. She pulled out her phone, her acrylic nails tapping loudly against the screen. "I am calling the police right now," she announced loudly, making sure the surrounding tables could hear her. "This woman is clearly deranged. She is trying to extort our wealthy family and cause a public disturbance. We need her arrested for harassment." The surrounding guests were whispering rapidly, watching the drama unfold. In the past, my family would have used this public pressure to crush me into submission, to force me to run away in shame. But they were playing checkers while I was playing chess. They had no idea the magnitude of the mistake they were making. The event organizer, Mr. Kensington, hurried over through the crowd, followed by two large security guards. He was a distinguished man who had been coordinating this charity gala for decades. My parents immediately turned to him, wearing their best expressions of victimhood. "Mr. Kensington, thank goodness you are here," Richard said, adopting a tone of deep concern. "This woman is an estranged relative who has been stalking us. She is causing a massive scene and making violent threats. Please have your security team throw her out immediately before she ruins this beautiful evening for your respectable guests." Mr. Kensington completely ignored my father. He stepped past Richard, bypassed my mother, and completely dismissed Cameron. He walked directly up to my table, placed a hand over his heart, and bowed deeply respectfully. "Ms. Savannah," he said, his voice filled with genuine deference and panic, "I am so incredibly sorry for this disturbance. Is there a problem here?" The collective gasp from my family was the sweetest sound I had heard in 2 decades. Cameron took a step back, his eyes darting between Mr. Kensington and me. Barbara's jaw actually dropped open, her heavy makeup unable to hide the sudden pale shock washing over her features. I smiled warmly at the organizer. "Yes, Mr. Kensington, there seems to be a slight misunderstanding. My estranged family thinks I am a stalker trying to extort their money. Please be so kind as to inform them who the platinum sponsor for tonight's charity gala is." Mr. Kensington turned to my father, his expression hardening into absolute professional disdain. "Sir, you are speaking to Savannah, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Equity. She is the platinum sponsor who single-handedly funded this entire event tonight." I stood up slowly, letting the custom silk of my gown cascade around me. I looked directly into Cameron's terrified eyes. And Mr. Kensington, I added, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. Please also remind brother, who owns the commercial bank, that currently holds the heavily defaulted mortgage on his massive estate. Mr. Kensington nodded sharply. Vanguard Equity owns the primary debt on all of your commercial and residential properties, sir. The silence that fell over my family was absolute and suffocating. They were entirely paralyzed, trapped in the terrifying realization that the ugly duckling they had discarded and robbed 20 years ago was now the billionaire holding the keys to their entire existence. I did not scream or gloat. I simply picked up my designer clutch, smoothed my hair, and delivered the final blow. If you excuse me, I said, stepping past my frozen mother. I have a $250,000 necklace to pay for. Enjoy the rest of the gala. It will likely be the last high society event you can afford to attend. I walked, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, leaving them drowning in the public humiliation they had tried to force on me. The war had officially begun, and I was holding an entire arsenal they could not even begin to comprehend. The flight back to New York had been remarkably peaceful. By Monday morning, I was sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my Manhattan penthouse, high above the noise of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of Central Park, while the thick soundproof walls blocked out the chaos of the world below. This penthouse was more than just a home. It was a fortress I had built entirely with my own hands. I sat behind my custom walnut desk, sipping black coffee and reviewing the final acquisition contracts for Vanguard Equity. The documents spread out before me detailed the absolute financial ruin of my brother's logistics company. I was reading through the itemized list of his defaulted loans and repossessed delivery trucks when the red emergency light on my secure internal phone began to flash. It was my head of building security. He sounded uncharacteristically panicked, which immediately put me on high alert. He told me a group claiming to be my immediate family had just bypassed the lobby desk. They had created a massive public scene, screaming that an elderly man was having a fatal heart attack and desperately needed his daughter's medical proxy. In the ensuing chaos of calling paramedics, they had shoved past the concierge and forced their way into my private express elevator. I did not panic. I simply reached under my heavy wooden desk and let my index finger rest lightly against a glowing blue button hidden seamlessly in the paneling. The heavy steel doors of my private elevator chimed. They slid open with a soft mechanical hum to reveal the three people I despised most in the entire world. My father Charles, my mother Beatrice, and my older brother Preston stepped directly into my home. They did not look anything like the polished, arrogant socialites who had tried to have me thrown out of the Chicago Charity Gala 48 hours earlier. The veneer of upper-class perfection had completely shattered. They looked feral and desperate. Preston wore a wrinkled dress shirt that looked like he had slept in it. Charles had deep, dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. Beatrice clutched her highly recognizable designer handbag so tightly against her chest that her knuckles were bone white. They stepped off the elevator and looked around my expansive living room, taking in the priceless modern art, the custom furniture, and the sheer magnitude of the wealth they had just discovered I possessed. Charles tried to immediately command the room. He puffed out his chest and marched toward my office area, pretending he still held some kind of patriarchal authority over me. "Turn off your computer, Jasmine," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. "We are not leaving this apartment until we settle this family dispute." I did not stand up to greet them. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of intimidation. I kept my hands resting flat on the cool leather blotter of my desk. "You have exactly 60 seconds to explain how you bypassed my security before I have you all arrested for breaking and entering," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. Beatrice stepped forward, her heels sinking into my expensive Persian rug. She tried to adopt a tone of wounded maternal authority, but her voice shook with poorly concealed rage. "You are our daughter. You do not get to humiliate us in front of the entire city of Chicago and just fly away to your little glass tower to hide. Do you have any idea what you did to us on Saturday night? You completely ruined your brother's reputation. Our friends are ignoring our calls. The country club board is already asking questions about our finances. Preston ruined his own reputation the moment he decided to throw a temper tantrum at a charity event, I replied, keeping my gaze locked on my mother. I simply matched his energy with my net worth. If the truth about your financial situation is humiliating, that is a failure of your own making. Charles slammed his hand down on the back of a velvet guest chair. We are not here to listen to your corporate lectures, you arrogant brat. We are here for compensation. You owe us $5 million. I want the funds transferred into my primary account by the close of business today. I stared at him for a long moment, letting the sheer absurdity of his demand hang in the air. I actually laughed. It was a harsh, cold sound that seemed to startle them. Compensation for what exactly? For raising you, Beatrice shrieked, dropping all pretense of composure. For putting food in your mouth and clothes on your back for 13 years. We paid for your medical bills. We paid for the roof over your head. You owe us for keeping you alive when you were nothing but a difficult, stubborn child. You have billions of dollars sitting in the bank while your own flesh and blood is struggling. $5 million is pocket change to you. It is the absolute least you can do to repay your debt to this family. Your delusion is truly fascinating, I said, leaning back in my chair. You legally disowned me when I was a minor. You kicked a 13-year-old girl out onto the street with $200 because she was not pretty enough for your family photos. You do not get to claim a return on an investment you threw into the garbage. You are owed nothing. Preston, who had been pacing near the elevator, finally broke. The pressure of his collapsing business and the reality of my immense wealth had clearly pushed him to the absolute breaking point. He stormed across the room, his face contorted with a violent, desperate rage. You think you are so untouchable sitting up here, Preston yelled, pointing a trembling finger at my face. You think because you wear expensive suits and own a private equity firm that you can just erase us. I know you bought my debt, Jasmine. I know Vanguard Equity is the holding company squeezing my logistics firm. You are doing this on purpose to destroy my life because you are still that bitter, jealous little freak who could not make any friends in high school. I am squeezing your firm because you are a terrible businessman who defaults on commercial loans, Preston. I corrected him, my tone completely devoid of emotion. The fact that I enjoy watching you squirm is just a pleasant bonus. His eyes darted wildly around my desk, taking in the multiple high-end monitors, the stacks of legal documents, and the heavy crystal paperweights. I was a man drowning in a stormy ocean, and he had just realized the only person with a life raft was the sister he had spent his entire life abusing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled checkbook. He slammed a blank check down onto the center of my desk, right over my acquisition contracts. Sign it! Preston demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural growl. You are going to sign a check for $5 million right now, or I swear to God I will tear this entire place apart. I looked down at the blank check and then back up at my brother's sweating, furious face. I am not giving you a single cent, I said. Preston completely lost his mind. He lunged across the desk, grabbing the edges of my dual monitors. With a vicious sweep of his arms, he violently shoved thousands of dollars worth of expensive hardware off my desk. The monitors crashed to the hardwood floor with a deafening shatter of glass and cracking plastic. Keyboards, mice, and crystal paperweights scattered across the room, smashing against the walls. Charles and Beatrice did not stop him. They simply stood there watching him vandalize my property with expressions of grim satisfaction, as if I somehow deserved this violence for refusing to comply with their extortion. Sign the check, Preston roared, slamming his fist down on the now empty surface of my desk, leaning so close to me I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on his furious face as I slowly and deliberately pressed my finger firmly against the glowing blue button hidden underneath my desk. The soft click of the hidden button under my desk was entirely silent to the frantic people destroying my office. Preston stood panting heavily over the wreckage of my shattered monitors, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked down at the broken glass and tangled wires, expecting me to finally break. He expected the tears that used to flow so freely when I was a terrified 13-year-old girl. But the only sound in the expansive penthouse was the erratic breathing of a desperate man who had just sealed his own fate. Beatrice stepped forward, her expensive heels crunching loudly over the shattered plastic of my keyboard. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You owe us!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. You sit up here in your glass tower judging us, but you owe us everything. We fed you for 13 years. We clothed you when you were an ungrateful, miserable little burden who refused to fit into our lifestyle. Her face twisted into a mask of aggressive self-righteousness as she continued to rewrite history to suit her own narrative. If we had not taken your college fund to buy Preston his starter business, he would not be where he is today. We made a necessary parental sacrifice. We took resources from the child who was going nowhere and invested them into the son who was destined for greatness. You should be thanking us for making the hard choices. You owe your brother this money. $5 million is absolutely nothing compared to the sacrifices we made keeping you under our roof. I looked at my mother, letting the sheer audacity of her historical revision wash over me. She had truly convinced herself that stealing a minor's inheritance was an act of noble financial strategy. I folded my hands, resting them on the only clean section of my desk. Destined for greatness. I repeated slowly, tasting the absolute delusion of the words. You mean bankrupt and currently under federal investigation for tax fraud. Preston physically stumbled backward. The aggressive posture he had maintained just moments before completely evaporated, leaving behind the terrified shell of a man caught in a massive lie. He whipped his head around to look at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Beatrice stopped breathing, her hand flying to her throat as the color drained from her face. Yes, Preston, I know everything. I continued, my voice remaining as calm and steady as a ticking clock. I know that you have been illegally inflating your revenue reports to secure secondary loans from major banks. I know that the Internal Revenue Service has been quietly auditing your logistics firm for the past 8 months. You are not a successful businessman. You are a criminal waiting for a federal indictment. And you honestly thought you could barge into my home, destroy my property, and extort $5 million to pay off your illegal debts before the federal agents knock on your door. The air in the penthouse grew incredibly thick, but instead of apologizing or backing down in the face of absolute ruin, my father Charles decided to double down. He stepped in front of Preston, physically shielding his golden boy from the reality of the situation. Charles straightened his tailored suit jacket, adopting the authoritative patriarchal stance he had used to terrorize me throughout my childhood. He placed both hands flat on my desk, leaning in close to try and intimidate me with his physical presence. You listen to me, you arrogant little brat! Charles growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, menacing register. You might think you hold all the cards because you have a fancy title and a fat bank account, but you have a reputation to protect. Publicly traded companies rely on absolute investor confidence, and investors do not like instability. They do not like unpredictable, unhinged chief executive officers running their portfolios. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. And what exactly does that mean, Charles? He smiled, a cruel, predatory grin that showed all his teeth. It means that if you do not wire $5 million into my primary account, by the end of this hour, I am calling every major media outlet in the city. I already have the narrative prepared and ready to send to my contacts at the major news networks. We will tell the world the tragic, heartbreaking story of our deeply troubled daughter. We will tell them you are mentally unstable. We will say you have a severe drug addiction that you have been desperately hiding from your board of directors. We will weep on national television about how you violently abandoned your loving, supportive family because the substance abuse made you paranoid and aggressive. Charles tapped his index finger against the wood of my desk, emphasizing his threat with every word. By tomorrow morning, Vanguard Equity's stock will plummet. Your shareholders will panic and dump their shares. Your board will demand an emergency psychological evaluation to remove you from power. The financial damage to your empire will be in the hundreds of millions, so I highly suggest you reconsider our request. $5 million is a very cheap price to pay to keep your reputation intact. It is essentially a bargain to keep your loving family quiet. He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest, looking incredibly smug. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He believed that the exact same manipulative tactics that worked on a defenseless teenager would somehow work on a woman who had clawed her way to the absolute peak of the global financial world. He thought my silence was fear. He did not realize my silence was simply the calm preparation before the execution. I let his heavy threat hang in the air for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch until it became suffocatingly uncomfortable. Then I smiled. It was a cold, detached smile that finally caused the smugness to falter on my father's face. I slowly lifted my right hand and pointed a single finger toward the expansive custom bookshelf that lined the far wall of my office. Did you really think a billionaire does not have 24/7 audio and video surveillance in her private residence? I asked softly. All three of them turned their heads simultaneously, following the direction of my pointed finger. Hidden perfectly within the dark spine of a thick leather-bound encyclopedia was a sleek modern device. A tiny, almost imperceptible blue light was blinking rhythmically in the shadows of the shelf. It was a state-of-the-art recording system directly wired to my private off-site servers. Beatrice gasped loudly, stumbling backward, until the back of her knees hit the edge of the velvet sofa, causing her to collapse onto the cushions. Preston grabbed his own hair, his eyes wide with sudden paralyzing terror, as he realized the magnitude of what he had just done. Charles stared at the blinking light, his face draining of all color, as the reality of his massive miscalculation crashed down upon him. The authoritative patriarch was suddenly reduced to a trembling old man caught in his own trap. I picked up my smartphone from the desk and tapped the screen once waking it up. I held the device up high so they could clearly see the active security video feed displaying on my screen. It showed a crystal-clear high-definition angle of the entire room. The playback buffered perfectly, showing Preston violently smashing my monitors, Beatrice screaming her confessions about stealing my inheritance, and Charles clearly and loudly detailing his exact plan to commit corporate blackmail. My elite legal team just received the live feed of you attempting extortion, destruction of private property, and corporate blackmail. I informed them, my voice slicing through their panicked silence. Every single threat you just made, every admission of guilt regarding my stolen college fund, and every detail of your intent to smear a public company has been recorded and backed up to multiple secure locations. You just handed me the exact evidence I need to put all three of you in a federal prison for a very long time. Preston began to hyperventilate violently, backing away toward the entryway. We have to go, he stammered, pushing past his mother and ignoring his father. We need to leave right now before they process the footage. He slammed his hand against the call button for the private elevator, desperately trying to summon the car to make his escape. He pressed the button over and over again, his breathing ragged and panicked. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, clutching her designer bag and rushing to join him at the elevator doors, leaving Charles standing frozen in front of my desk. I remained comfortably seated in my leather chair, watching them completely unravel. You can press that button all you want, Preston, I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the spacious penthouse. But it will not do you any good. I pressed the security override under my desk the moment you bypass the concierge downstairs. The elevator is already on its way up, and the police are already inside it. The elevator doors parted with a soft mechanical chime. Two uniformed New York City police officers stepped into the foyer, followed closely by my personal head of security. Preston froze, his hand still hovering over the call button for the elevator. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child rather than a corporate executive. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek as one of the officers instructed them to place their hands behind their backs. She dropped her designer handbag, spilling expensive lipstick and maxed-out credit cards across my hardwood floor. Charles attempted to use his authoritative voice, demanding the officers stop and threatening to call the police commissioner, who he claimed was a personal friend. The officers were entirely unimpressed by his blustering. They swiftly secured his wrists, ignoring his loud protests about his social standing and his rights. I remained perfectly still behind my desk, watching them being read their rights and escorted out in handcuffs. I watched the steel doors close on their furious, panicked faces. I knew they would make bail by the morning. Men like my father always had a dirty fixer on speed dial to pull them out of a holding cell. But I also knew the extortion charges hanging over their heads would make them incredibly desperate. And desperate people always make fatal mistakes. 3 days later, I was sitting in a private dining room at one of Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurants. I was hosting a high-stakes business lunch with the board members of a major European tech firm. The acquisition deal we were finalizing was worth over $4 billion. The atmosphere was refined, quiet, and intensely focused. We were discussing international market expansions when my secure internal phone vibrated softly against the linen tablecloth. It was an emergency alert from my primary wealth management team. I excused myself for a moment, pulling the device into my lap to review the incoming file. The message from my chief financial officer was marked with the highest level of urgency. A temporary freeze had just been placed on every single one of my personal bank accounts. I read the attached legal filing with a mixture of cold amusement and absolute disgust. In a desperate retaliation to avoid prison time for their penthouse extortion attempt, my family had utilized a highly corrupt legal channel. They had hired a notoriously unethical attorney, known for bribing local judges to push through fraudulent injunctions. The basis for this catastrophic asset freeze was a single piece of paper. It was a supposed contract dated 20 years ago. The document claimed that I had legally pledged 50% of my lifetime earnings to the family trust in exchange for my upbringing and basic care. They were actually trying to enforce a commercial contract supposedly signed by a 13-year-old girl. It was a blatant legal trap. The freeze was designed to starve me of my personal liquid assets and force me to the negotiating table. Charles and Preston wanted me to drop the criminal extortion charges and hand over my wealth in exchange for lifting the injunction. They genuinely thought that cutting off my access to my personal funds would induce a blind panic. They thought I would crumble under the sudden financial restriction and come crawling back to them begging for relief. I looked up from my screen and smiled warmly at the European executive sitting across the table. I did not gasp or excuse myself in tears. I did not frantically call my bankers to beg for a quick resolution. I simply placed my phone back into my designer bag and smoothly guided the conversation back to the final terms of our multi-billion-dollar acquisition. I was not a scared teenager anymore. I was a corporate predator, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a trap. When the exorbitant bill for the lunch arrived in a heavy leather folder, I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. My personal accounts were frozen, but my corporate expense accounts tied directly to Vanguard Equity were entirely separate and completely untouched by their petty injunction. I slid my solid black corporate card into the folder, handed it to the waiter, and graciously thanked my guests for their time and their partnership. As I stepped out of the restaurant and into the crisp afternoon air, my personal driver was waiting with the door of my luxury sedan open. "Take me to the law offices of Montgomery and Pierce," I instructed him, my voice radiating absolute cold determination. The drive across the city gave me time to review the digital copy of the forged contract my security team had intercepted from the court filings. It was a laughable piece of fiction. My father had clearly printed it on old stationery from his previous business and forged my teenage signature at the bottom of the page. The sheer arrogance required to submit such a blatantly fraudulent document to a federal court was staggering, but perfectly in line with his massive unchecked ego. He believed his status protected him from basic scrutiny. The offices of Montgomery and Pierce were located in a flashy but ultimately tasteless building in the financial district. It was the exact kind of firm that relied on aggressive intimidation tactics and backroom deals rather than actual legal prowess. I bypassed the front reception desk, entirely ignoring the receptionist who stood up and called out for me to stop. Two of my heavily built personal security guards flanked me, ensuring nobody attempted to physically block my path as I marched down the hallway. I walked straight down the main corridor toward the largest corner office. The heavy glass door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the loud sound of familiar laughter echoing from within the room. I pushed the door open without bothering to knock and stepped into the space. My father Charles and my brother Preston were sitting in plush leather chairs. They were out on bail, but they did not look like men facing serious felony charges. Instead, they looked triumphant. They were holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne clinking glasses, with a slick-looking lawyer in a pinstripe suit. They were actively celebrating my supposed financial ruin. Preston was leaning back in his chair laughing loudly about how incredibly easy it had been to lock up my accounts. "I bet she is hyperventilating right now." Preston gloated, taking a large sip of his champagne. She probably tried to buy a coffee this morning and got her card declined. By the end of the week, she will be begging us to drop the injunction just so she can afford to eat. We have her exactly where we want her. Charles nodded, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. It is about time she learned her place in this family hierarchy. She thought she could throw us out of her apartment and send us to jail. Now she understands who really holds the power. She will sign over the $5 million by Friday, and we will generously agree to drop the lawsuit. It is a brilliant strategy. I stood in the doorway observing their pathetic celebration for a long moment before I finally spoke. You should really save that champagne for your upcoming prison sentences, I said, my voice cutting through their laughter like a frozen blade. Preston choked on his drink, coughing violently as he spilled champagne down the front of his shirt. Charles snapped his head toward the door, his smug expression instantly vanishing as he saw me standing there flanked by my massive security detail. The slick lawyer Montgomery stood up from his desk, his face paling slightly as he recognized who I was. "What are you doing here?" Charles demanded, scrambling to his feet and trying to regain his authoritative posture. "You have no right to barge into a private legal meeting. Your accounts are frozen, Jasmine. You are entirely cut off. You have absolutely nothing left until you agree to our terms and drop those ridiculous extortion charges." I stepped fully into the office, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. I did not look like a woman who had just lost access to her personal wealth. I looked like the billionaire chief executive officer who owned the building they were currently standing in. "I am here to inform you that your little legal trap is the most pathetic display of desperation I have ever witnessed," I said, walking directly up to the mahogany desk. Did you honestly believe that freezing my personal checking accounts would somehow paralyze a woman who controls a global holding company? My corporate assets alone could buy and sell your entire bloodline 100 times over. The lawyer Montgomery tried to step forward, puffing out his chest to defend his clients. "Ms. Jasmine," he began, his tone dripping with false legal authority, "this is highly inappropriate. We have a valid court order enforcing a legally binding contract that you signed pledging 50% of your earnings to the family trust. That document has been properly notarized and filed. Breaking that freeze will take you years of expensive litigation. Your business operations will be completely strangled while this works its way through the courts. I suggest you sit down and negotiate a settlement right now." I turned my gaze to the corrupt attorney, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction for the trap I was about to spring. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a thick bound document, setting it down right next to their champagne bottle. "I do not need years of litigation, Mr. Montgomery," I replied, maintaining direct eye contact, "because I brought a forensic audit report directly from my security division." The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the sound of Preston setting his champagne flute down with a shaky clatter. Charles stared at the thick bound document I had just placed on the desk. His facial muscles twitched as his brain struggled to process the words forensic audit. For a man who had spent his entire life bullying people with imaginary authority, actual hard evidence was a completely foreign concept. He let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. He reached out and pushed the folder away with the back of his hand, refusing to even open the cover. "You expect us to be intimidated by a fake report? You had your security guards type up in the lobby." Charles sneered, his voice regaining its usual arrogant volume. "We have the original contract, Jasmine. We have the physical paper with your actual signature on it. You can print out as many fake corporate audits as you want, but it does not change history." He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with the exact same expression of absolute disgust he had worn 20 years ago when he told me I was too hideous to be seen in the family holiday portraits. "You were a naive, ugly teenager," he gloated, his tone dripping with malicious satisfaction. "You were desperate for our approval. You signed whatever we put in front of you because you were terrified we would send you to a boarding school for troubled girls. You did not even read the papers we gave you. You just scribbled your name and went back to hiding in your bedroom like a pathetic little freak." I did not break eye contact. I let him finish his revisionist history, letting him dig himself so deeply into his own lie that the truth would bury him completely. "I was 13 years old. Charles," I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of the fear he so desperately wanted to see. "I was a minor. Legally speaking, any commercial contract signed by a 13-year-old child, pledging 50% of her lifetime earnings to a family trust, is unenforceable on its face. It is a laughable legal concept that any competent judge would throw out in summary judgment. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the desk, watching the false confidence begin to fracture in my father's eyes. But more importantly, I continued. I was a minor who successfully filed for legal emancipation the week before you kicked me out. Charles froze. Preston's mouth fell open. You think I did not know you were draining my college fund, I asked, allowing a razor-sharp edge of mockery to enter my voice. I was a mathematical prodigy. I hacked into your home office computer when I was 12 and saw exactly how deep your debts were. I knew you were stealing my inheritance to buy Preston his business. So I secured legal emancipation and severed all financial ties to you before you even handed me that $200 and locked the front door. You literally cannot enforce a contract against an emancipated minor who was no longer your legal dependent. The lawyer Montgomery immediately sensed that his clients were losing ground. He realized that the arrogant father and son he was representing were entirely out of their depth against me. He stepped around the mahogany desk, physically placing himself between my family and me. He smoothed his expensive pinstripe tie and adopted a smug, condescending posture. That is a very compelling story, Ms. Jasmine Montgomery stated, his tone slick with false legal authority. But it is completely irrelevant to your current situation. Emancipation records from 20 years ago take months to subpoena and verify. The document we submitted to the court this morning has been fully notarized and verified by a sworn witness. The judge assigned to this case signed the injunction an hour ago. Montgomery leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk to mirror the aggressive stance my father had taken earlier. You clearly do not understand how the justice system actually works for people with real power, he lectured smoothly. The temporary freeze on your personal accounts is absolute. Breaking that freeze will take you years of aggressive, complicated litigation. We will file motion after motion. We will request endless discovery. We will drag you into depositions until you forget what daylight looks like. He smiled a greasy, triumphant grin. In the meantime, your business operations will be completely strangled. Your board of directors will see a chief executive officer entangled in a massive, highly publicized family lawsuit over her personal wealth. Your shareholders will panic. Your liquid capital will dry up, and we will effectively starve you out. You might be a billionaire on paper, but right now you cannot even buy a cup of coffee without asking my permission. Montgomery picked up his champagne flute and took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining his smug eye contact with me. I strongly suggest you sit down at this table right now, he commanded. We can draft a settlement agreement. You sign over the $5 million to your father, drop the criminal extortion charges against your family, and I will personally call the judge to have the freeze lifted by tomorrow morning. It is the only logical choice you have left. I looked at Montgomery. I looked at this pathetic, corrupt attorney who truly believed he had outmaneuvered the woman who routinely dismantled international banking conglomerates for sport. I reached out and placed my hand on top of the forensic audit report I had brought into the room. I slowly flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. It is fascinating that you bring up the concept of a sworn witness. Mr. Montgomery, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. And it is even more fascinating that I supposedly signed this highly binding contract 20 years ago. I turned the document around so it faced the corrupt lawyer. I tapped my manicured fingernail against a highly magnified, high-resolution photograph of the signature on their forged contract. Because according to the molecular breakdown conducted by my security team's forensic laboratory, I explained the ink used to forge my signature on your document is a proprietary chemical blend. It is a specific type of anti-fade gel ink manufactured by a boutique stationery company based in Switzerland. I watched the color drain completely out of Montgomery's face. The smug, arrogant smile vanished, instantly replaced by the stark, wide-eyed terror of a man who just realized he had stepped on a landmine. That specific Swiss stationery company did not exist 20 years ago. I continued driving the final nail into his professional coffin. In fact, they did not patent that specific chemical ink blend until exactly 14 months ago. Which means the document you submitted to a federal judge this morning is a physical impossibility. You did not just file a fraudulent claim, Mr. Montgomery. You knowingly submitted a forged document to a federal court in an attempt to extort a corporate officer. Montgomery stumbled backward, bumping into Charles. He dropped his champagne flute. The delicate crystal shattered against the floor, spraying expensive alcohol across his polished leather shoes. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate some kind of slimy legal defense, but his voice completely failed him. I did not wait for his response. I simply raised my left hand and tapped the face of my smartwatch twice. The heavy glass door of the corner office was violently thrown open. It hit the wall with a thunderous crash that made Preston scream and physically cower behind his chair. My elite legal team stepped into the room. They were not wearing flashy pinstripe suits. They wore sharp-tailored black and moved with the synchronized precision of an executing army. But they were not alone. Flanking my lead attorneys were 4 federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers, with the letters FBI printed in stark yellow across their chests. Charles let out a strangled gasp, backing away until he hit the floor-to-ceiling windows. Preston covered his face with his hands shaking uncontrollably. Arthur Montgomery, the lead federal agent, announced, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority. You are under arrest for felony forgery, conspiracy to commit extortion, and defrauding a federal court. 2 agents moved instantly across the room. They grabbed Montgomery roughly by the shoulders, spinning him around and slamming him face first against his own mahogany desk. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the sound of Montgomery sobbing and begging for a chance to explain. My lead corporate attorney, a ruthless woman named Victoria, stepped forward and tossed a fresh legal document onto the desk, right next to Montgomery's face. The injunction against Ms. Jasmine's accounts was vacated exactly 3 minutes ago, Victoria stated coldly. The judge you bribed is currently being detained in his chambers by a separate federal unit. Your firm is effectively dissolved as of this moment. I stood perfectly still, watching the federal agents drag the weeping, corrupt lawyer out of the office. The absolute destruction of their legal shield happened in less than 60 seconds. Charles and Preston were left standing in the wreckage of the room, completely exposed, entirely defenseless, and utterly terrified. I turned my gaze to my father and my brother. They looked like cornered animals, realizing the trap they built had just snapped shut on their own necks. You tried to starve me out, I said, my voice soft, but carrying the weight of an absolute promise. You tried to steal from me when I was a child, and you tried to steal from me today. But you forgot one very important detail about the girl you threw away. Charles stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a paralyzing fear he had never experienced in his entire privileged life. I own the bank, Charles whispered, and your time is completely up. The aftermath of the raid on the law office left my family scrambling in a state of absolute terror, with their corrupt attorney sitting in a federal holding cell and their fraudulent asset freeze completely dissolved. My father and brother were forced to face the crushing reality of their financial situation. The commercial bank I controlled had officially processed the default notices on every single property Charles owned. Their credit lines were frozen, not by a corrupt judge, but by the mathematical reality of their massive unpaid debts. But narcissists rarely accept defeat gracefully. Instead of facing reality and downsizing their lives, they frantically searched for a miraculous escape hatch. Preston found his supposed salvation in a blind corporate acquisition. His logistics empire was bleeding capital so rapidly that his delivery drivers were walking off the job due to bounced paychecks. His warehouses were facing eviction. In an act of pure desperation, he had blindly shopped his failing company to a massive anonymous private equity firm known for buying up distressed assets. The firm had expressed immediate interest in a total buyout. Preston was so blinded by his own greed and panic that he did not bother to conduct even a basic background check on the shell corporation handling the negotiations. He saw a multi-million-dollar lifeline and grabbed it with both hands. I truly believed this anonymous buyer was going to absorb his massive debts, inject fresh capital into his business, and save his family from the total humiliation I had promised them. He convinced Charles and Beatrice that this buyout would secure their lavish lifestyle and prove that they did not need my money to survive. On the morning of the acquisition meeting, my family arrived at a prestigious commercial building in the heart of the financial district. They had rented the most expensive executive boardroom available on the top floor, trying to project a false image of immense wealth and stability to their anonymous saviors. They wanted to look like titans of industry, rather than desperate fraudsters begging for a bailout. I arrived at the building 15 minutes early, stepping out of my vehicle surrounded by my corporate acquisition team. We rode the private elevator in total silence. When we reached the executive floor, I instructed my team to remain in the hallway. I wanted to step into this specific room completely alone. Through the thick frosted glass walls of the boardroom, I could see the blurry outlines of my family. They were already celebrating. Beatrice was wearing a brand new designer suit that she had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card. She was pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses and chatting animatedly with Charles. My father was leaning back in a plush leather chair looking relaxed and arrogant, his previous terror seemingly forgotten. Preston was pacing back and forth across the front of the room. He kept adjusting his expensive silk tie, checking his reflection in the glass, and practicing his corporate smile. They were completely oblivious to the slaughter that was about to take place. I waited until the digital clock on the wall struck exactly 10 in the morning, the precise moment the meeting was scheduled to begin. I reached out and pushed the heavy boardroom doors open. The solid brass latch clicked loudly, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet professional space. Preston spun around instantly. He threw his shoulders back and plastered a charming, welcoming smile across his face, ready to greet the billionaire investors who were going to save his life. The moment his eyes registered my face, the charming smile shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked physically ill. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the edge of the conference table. Beatrice dropped the crystal pitcher of water. It hit the table with a loud thud, spilling cold water across the polished wood and ruining a stack of printed financial projections. Charles bolted upright out of his chair, his face instantly turning a violent shade of red. "What in the world are you doing here?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "How did you get past the building security?" I did not answer him. I walked slowly and deliberately into the room, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind me. The soft click of the lock sealing us inside seemed to echo in the sudden tense silence. I moved with absolute calm, my heels sinking into the thick carpet as I walked the entire length of the room. I bypassed the guest chairs. I ignored the side seating. I walked directly to the high-backed leather chair positioned at the absolute head of the long table, the seat reserved strictly for the person holding all the power. I pulled the chair out, sat down gracefully, and placed my sleek leather portfolio flat on the table in front of me. I folded my hands over the leather and looked at the three of them. "Get out of that chair!" Charles bellowed, slamming his fist down on the table. "You are trespassing on a private corporate floor. This is a closed executive meeting. We are expecting highly important investors any second now, and you are not going to sit here and ruin this deal out of petty jealousy." Beatrice rushed forward, her face contorted with the same aggressive hatred she had shown at the charity gala. "You are completely obsessed with us," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. "You are a sick, pathetic stalker. You tried to freeze our bank accounts, and when that failed, you decided to follow us to a business meeting. You cannot stand the fact that your brother is about to close a multi-million-dollar deal that will make him richer than you will ever be. You are a disgusting, jealous little freak, and you need to leave right this second." I remained perfectly still. I let their insults wash over me like rain against a stone wall. Their anger was completely hollow, fueled entirely by a desperate, blinding fear. They were terrified that the anonymous buyers would walk through the door, see this family drama, and cancel the acquisition. They had absolutely no idea that the buyer was already sitting in the room. Preston grabbed the sleek conference phone from the center of the table, his hands shaking violently as he punched the button for the front desk. "Security!" he yelled into the speakerphone, his voice completely devoid of professional composure. "I need armed guards in boardroom A immediately. We have a deranged trespasser who is refusing to leave, and she is disrupting a critical financial negotiation. Send someone up here right now and call the police." He slammed the phone down and pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You are going to jail, Jasmine," he threatened, his chest heaving with exertion. "You think you are so smart, but you just crossed a massive legal line. This is corporate sabotage. My investors will be here any moment, and when they arrive, they are going to watch you get dragged out of this building in handcuffs. Charles moved around the table, attempting to physically intimidate me by looming over my chair. He tried to project the menacing authority that used to make me cower in my bedroom 20 years ago. Listen to your brother, Jasmine. Charles growled, his face inches from mine. You played your little games last week and you caused some minor inconveniences. But this is the real world of high finance. We are dealing with a massive private equity firm today. These are serious people with serious money. They will not tolerate a hysterical woman crashing their boardroom. If you do not stand up and walk out of that door right now, I will personally make sure the police press maximum charges for corporate espionage and trespassing. We will bury you in so many civil lawsuits you will not have a dime left to your name. Beatrice crossed her arms, nodding vigorously in agreement with her husband. You are just trying to sabotage him because you know you could never build a real legacy. She mocked, her voice dripping with venom. Preston is about to secure our family's future. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who wants everyone else to be as miserable as you are. Get out of that chair and get out of our sight before the buyers walk in and see what a complete disaster you are. I looked at the three of them, taking in their sweating foreheads, their bulging veins, and their complete lack of emotional control. They were drowning people, screaming at the ocean, demanding the waves stop moving. They had spent their entire lives living in a fabricated reality where they were the untouchable heroes and I was the disposable villain. They were so deeply entrenched in their own narcissism that they could not see the massive shadow of the guillotine hanging directly over their heads. I slowly unclasped the metal lock on my portfolio and flipped the cover open, revealing the thick stack of acquisition contracts inside. I smoothed the pristine white paper with the palm of my hand and finally broke my silence. You have been stealing my ideas since I was a kid, Preston, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. You stole my middle school robotics project and submitted it to the selection committee to win your prestigious college scholarship. You built your entire academic foundation on the intellectual labor of a 13-year-old girl. You spent your whole life taking my hard work, erasing my name and pasting your own over it, because you are entirely incapable of creating anything of value on your own. You manipulated and stole your way through life, because our parents taught you that taking from me was your birthright. But you cannot steal a corporate buyout. Preston stared at me, his jaw working silently as he tried to formulate a defense. The sudden exposure of his deepest academic secret in front of his wife left him completely paralyzed. He had built his entire identity on the myth of his own genius. Hearing the truth spoken aloud in a sterile corporate boardroom shattered the illusion he had spent decades maintaining. Charles slammed his hand against the glass wall of the boardroom, his face purple with rage. "How dare you bring up ancient history?" he roared, trying to drown out my words with sheer volume. Preston deserved that scholarship. He was the older brother. He was the one carrying the family legacy. You were just a weird little girl playing with wires in the basement. It was your duty to help him succeed. You should be honored that your little project helped launch his incredible business career. His incredible business career. I repeated slowly, letting a cold laugh escape my lips. You mean the logistics empire that currently cannot afford to put fuel in its own delivery trucks? You mean the company that has not made payroll in 3 weeks? That is a truly fascinating definition of a successful legacy, Charles. Diana, who had been standing frozen beside Preston, suddenly snapped out of her shock. Her eyes darted aggressively around the room as she desperately tried to salvage the situation. She had married Preston entirely for his supposed wealth and status. She refused to believe that the golden ticket she had secured was currently burning to ashes in front of her. Diana marched up to the conference table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor. She slammed her hands down on the polished wood, trying to mirror the authority I naturally possessed. "You are completely delusional, Jasmine." Diana spat, her face twisted into a massive, condescending sneer. "You stole those documents from some junior administrative desk just to come in here and play pretend. We know exactly who we are meeting with today. We are meeting with the executive board of Vanguard Equity. They manage billions in global assets. They are serious people, and when they walk through those heavy doors, I am going to personally expose you to them. She leaned across the table, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. I am going to tell the real investors exactly what you are doing. I will tell them you are just a bitter, estranged sister, trying to sabotage a legitimate business deal out of deep-seated childhood jealousy. I will tell them you are a mentally unstable fraud, trying to ruin your successful brother, because you could never measure up to him. They will have you arrested for corporate espionage, and we will proceed with the buyout while you are sitting in a police cruiser. I let Diana finish her desperate, frantic rant. I let her lay out all her empty threats and false assumptions, watching her chest heave with the exertion of her own arrogance. She truly believed that she was the smartest woman in the room. She believed that playing the victim and utilizing the exact same smear tactics my parents used would somehow save her sinking ship. I looked at Diana, letting a cold, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. I reached out and slowly slid the heavy leather acquisition portfolio across the smooth, polished wood of the conference table. I pushed it directly into Diana's hands. I am the investor. Diana, I stated clearly, my voice echoing powerfully through the silent boardroom. Vanguard Equity is the holding company buying out Preston's debt. Diana looked down at the open portfolio. Her eyes scanned the crisp legal documents, focusing instantly on the bold corporate letterhead printed at the top of the page. She saw the seal of Vanguard Equity. She saw the detailed financial breakdown of Preston's ruined company. And then her eyes slowly drifted down to the bottom of the final page to the solid black ink of the primary authorizing signature line. She saw my full name printed in bold capital letters underneath the title of Chief Executive Officer and Majority Shareholder. The color completely drained from Diana's face. The aggressive, arrogant posture she had held just a second ago dissolved into pure, unadulterated horror. Her hands began to shake so violently that the thick pages of the contract rattled loudly against the wood table. She stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of a guest chair. Preston lunged forward and snatched the portfolio from his wife. He stared at the documents, his eyes darting frantically across the pages, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves into something else. He saw his own catastrophic debt laid out in clinical mathematical detail. He saw the exact terms of the buyout he had been begging for. And he saw my name sitting at the very top of the corporate food chain, holding absolute power over his survival. No, Preston whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. No, this is impossible. This cannot be real. You cannot be the buyer. You cannot own this company. Beatrice rushed to her son's side, grabbing his arm in a blind panic. What does it say, Preston? She demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. What does the paper say? Tell me it is a fake. Tell me she is lying to us. Preston dropped the portfolio onto the table as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with a level of absolute terror I had never witnessed before. He finally realized that he had not walked into a rescue mission. He had walked willingly into an execution chamber. I remained perfectly still in my chair, absorbing their total devastation. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently and brutally. I looked directly into my brother's eyes, watching the last remaining shred of his false reality burn to the ground. And I am not here to bail you out, Preston. I declared, my words falling like heavy stones in the silent room. I did not arrange this meeting to save your company or protect your lavish lifestyle. I brought you here to look you in the face while I pull the plug. I am here to officially deny the acquisition on the corporate record and call in all of your debts immediately. Preston let out a strangled gasp, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. You are bankrupt effective at the close of business today. I continued, showing absolutely no mercy. Vanguard Equity owns the primary notes on your commercial warehouses. We own the leases on your delivery fleet. We own the massive penalty fees on your defaulted loans. I am instructing my asset management team to begin liquidating your company in exactly 1 hour. Your trucks will be repossessed by noon. Your warehouses will be padlocked by sunset. You will have to go back to your office and explain to your hundreds of unpaid employees why their paychecks are bouncing while you stand there with absolutely nothing to your name. Charles charged forward, his face twisted in disbelief and rage. You cannot do this, he roared, slamming his hands on the table. You will destroy the family name. If Preston goes bankrupt, the bank will seize my estate. I put my home up as collateral for his business loans. You will leave your own mother and father homeless. I tilted my head, looking at the man who had thrown me out onto the street when I was a child. You put your house up as collateral for a failing business run by a man who steals middle school science projects, Charles. That sounds like a terrible financial decision. And as for leaving you homeless, I suggest you start packing your bags. The foreclosure process is incredibly swift when the bank is highly motivated. Diana began to hyperventilate, clutching her designer purse and backing away from Preston as if he were suddenly diseased. You lied to me, she screamed at her husband, tears streaming down her face. You told me you were a titan of industry. You told me this buyout was guaranteed. I am not staying married to a bankrupt fraud who relies on his estranged sister for survival. I am calling a divorce lawyer right now. Diana turned and bolted for the heavy boardroom doors, ripping them open and sprinting out into the hallway without looking back. Preston let out a pathetic wail and took a step as if to chase after her, but his legs completely gave out. He collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly. The golden child, the supposed genius of the family, was reduced to a weeping, ruined mess in the middle of a corporate boardroom. Beatrice fell to her knees beside Preston's chair, wrapping her arms around him and crying hysterically. She looked up at me, her heavy makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Please, Jasmine, she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. Please do not do this. We are your family. We will do anything you want. Just sign the acquisition papers and save him. I am begging you. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket with smooth, practiced efficiency. I picked up my leather portfolio and looked down at the pathetic, weeping remnants of my abusers. You threw me away because I did not fit into your perfect picture, I said, my voice completely cold and final. Now you have no picture left. Have a wonderful afternoon. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the doors wide open behind me. My corporate acquisition team was waiting in the hallway, standing in professional silence. I handed the portfolio to my lead director. The acquisition is denied, I instructed him without breaking my stride. Liquidate everything. Leave them with absolutely nothing. The liquidation of Preston's logistics empire took exactly 48 hours. It was a masterclass in corporate efficiency. My asset management team moved with absolute precision, securing the warehouses, freezing the commercial accounts, and dispatching teams of repossession agents to collect the delivery fleet. The physical dismantling of my brother's fraudulent legacy was swift and entirely legal. By Wednesday morning, he was officially locked out of his own headquarters, his access badges deactivated, and his remaining employees briefed by Vanguard Equity transition managers. I expected them to retreat. I expected the crushing reality of their total financial ruin to finally silence them. I assumed that facing multiple federal investigations and immediate foreclosure would force Charles, Beatrice, and Preston to pack whatever they had left and quietly disappear into obscurity. But I had underestimated the sheer boundless magnitude of their narcissism. When cornered by their own failures, people like my family do not reflect or apologize. They attack. They pivot and immediately seek out a new audience to manipulate. I was sitting in my office reviewing the quarterly earnings reports when my phone began to vibrate violently across the surface of my desk. It was not a single notification, but a rapid, continuous stream of alerts. My corporate communications director, David, burst through my office doors a moment later without waiting for his customary invitation. He was holding a sleek silver tablet, his face pale and shining with a thin layer of nervous sweat. We have a massive situation, Jasmine. David said, his voice tight with professional panic. It is trending across every major social media platform right now. The major news networks are already picking it up for their evening broadcasts. He walked around my desk and placed the tablet directly in front of me. I looked down at the high-definition screen. A video was playing automatically. It was a masterfully produced piece of emotional manipulation designed specifically to weaponize the court of public opinion. The video opened with a tight shot of my mother, Beatrice. She was sitting on a modest floral sofa, looking completely unrecognizable. The heavy, expensive makeup she usually wore had been entirely scrubbed away, leaving her face looking pale and intentionally aged. She was wearing a simple faded cardigan that I knew for a fact she would normally never allow in her wardrobe. She looked like a frail, heartbroken grandmother, rather than the vicious socialite who had tried to extort me just days prior. Charles sat beside her, his posture slumped, holding her hand with a trembling grip. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes watering on command. "We never wanted to make this public," Charles said, his voice cracking with manufactured grief. "We are private people who just love our family, but our daughter Jasmine has lost her mind. Wealth has completely destroyed her soul. She has become a ruthless sociopathic billionaire, and she is using her limitless power to systematically destroy our lives out of pure spite." The video cut to a shot of Preston. He was standing outside the padlocked gates of his repossessed logistics warehouse. He was wearing a cheap, unironed button-down shirt, attempting to look like a hardworking blue-collar man who had just been crushed by the corporate machine. "I gave my sister everything," Preston said to the camera, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "When she was a teenager struggling with severe mental health issues and drug addiction. My parents sacrificed their entire life savings to get her help. We loved her. We supported her. And how does she repay us? She buys out my commercial debt in secret and liquidates my company, throwing hundreds of innocent people out of work just to settle a petty childhood grudge." The video cut back to Beatrice, who was now openly weeping, dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. "She is evicting us from our family home," Beatrice sobbed, her voice echoing with tragic desperation. "My husband has a heart condition. We are elderly and sick. And our own billionaire daughter is throwing us out onto the street. We have absolutely nothing left. We just want our daughter back. We just want the Jasmine we love to stop hurting us." I watched the entire 5-minute video in complete silence. It was a spectacular work of fiction. They had twisted every single truth, weaponizing their own crimes and projecting them onto me. They painted me as a cold, unfeeling monster crushing her poor sick parents and hardworking brother under the heel of my corporate boots. The production value was high, clearly filmed and edited by a professional crisis management firm they had undoubtedly hired on credit. David nervously tapped the edge of the tablet. "The engagement metrics are catastrophic, Jasmine. They have over 4 million views across 3 platforms in just 2 hours. The comment sections are a bloodbath. People are organizing protests outside our headquarters. They have created a hashtag demanding federal investigations into your acquisition practices. The public absolutely loves a victim narrative, and your family is playing the part flawlessly. They look like helpless senior citizens being bullied by a billionaire tyrant." I calmly pushed the tablet away and took a slow sip of my coffee. The coffee was still warm. The sky outside my window was still blue. My pulse had not elevated a single beat. "What is your recommendation, David?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured. David swallowed hard, pulling a thick blue folder from under his arm. He opened it and laid out a series of public relations strategy documents. "We need to kill this story immediately before it impacts our stock value. I have already drafted a quiet settlement agreement. We offer them a one-time payout of $10 million. We frame it publicly as a generous philanthropic family donation to secure their retirement and help your brother transition to a new venture." He pointed to a specific clause in his drafted contract. "In exchange for the funds, they sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. They take down the videos, they retract their statements, and they permanently disappear. $10 million is a rounding error for Vanguard Equity, Jasmine. It is a tiny fraction of our daily operating budget. We pay them, we shut down the media circus, and we protect the corporate brand. If we fight them publicly, we look like the villains. A billionaire punching down at a bankrupt family is an unwinnable public relations war." I looked at my communications director. He was a brilliant man who excelled at managing corporate optics, but he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the people we were dealing with. He viewed this as a business transaction. He thought my family was acting rationally motivated by a specific financial goal. He did not understand that for narcissists, the money was secondary to the control. "David," I said, folding my hands on the desk, "let me explain exactly why your strategy is a guaranteed failure. If I hand them $10 million today, they will spend it in a year. They will buy back their country club memberships, they will purchase new luxury cars, and they will continue to live far beyond their means. And when that money runs out, they will realize that public extortion is a highly profitable business model. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the busy Manhattan streets below. They will find a loophole in your non-disclosure agreement. They will threaten to write a tell-all book. They will go on daytime talk shows claiming I forced them into silence. If I pay them, I am validating their tactics. I am teaching them that if they scream loud enough and lie boldly enough, I will reward them with millions of dollars. I am not going to fund my own hostage crisis. But the optics, David protested, stepping forward. Jasmine, the major news outlets are already running with this. They have scheduled a primetime interview for tomorrow evening. The narrative is cementing. You are going to be branded as a sociopath. Your reputation will take a massive hit. My reputation is built on delivering unparalleled returns to my investors, not on being a beloved public figure, I replied sharply. I do not care if anonymous strangers on the internet think I am a monster. I care about reality. And the reality is that my family stole my inheritance, committed felony forgery, and attempted to extort me for $5 million. They are currently out on bail for federal crimes while simultaneously painting themselves as innocent victims on social media. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I picked up the blue folder containing David's proposed settlement agreement. I ripped the document precisely in half and dropped the pieces into the wastebasket at my feet. I will not negotiate with abusers. David, I declared, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. I will not hand over a single penny to the people who threw me out onto the street when I was a child. They want a public spectacle. They want a media circus. They want to drag this family drama into the light of day to force my hand. David looked at the torn papers in the trash and then back up at me, his professional anxiety giving way to a deep, fearful respect. So what is our counter move? He asked quietly. Our counter move is complete annihilation, I said, pressing the intercom button on my desk to summon my lead, corporate attorney. If they want to play their game in the court of public opinion, I am going to make sure the entire world sees exactly who they are. They brought a scripted video to a gunfight, David. Now I am going to show them what real corporate warfare looks like. I watched the evening broadcast from the massive flat screen mounted on the wall of my office. My lead corporate attorney, Victoria, sat beside me taking meticulous notes on a legal pad. The network had given my family a primetime slot for an exclusive interview. The host was a notorious journalist known for creating sensationalized victim narratives, and my family was feeding her absolute gold. The camera zoomed in tight on Beatrice. She had perfected her distressed elderly mother routine. She dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, trembling slightly as she looked directly into the lens. We gave her everything, Beatrice cried, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. We loved her despite her developmental flaws. We spent years trying to help her fit into normal society, but she was always so angry and distant. And now she is trying to destroy her brother out of sheer ugly jealousy. Developmental flaws. That was what my mother called my childhood brilliance. Because I preferred advanced calculus over country club pageants, and because I did not know how to make superficial small talk with her wealthy friends, she labeled me defective. She had always used my social awkwardness as a weapon to isolate me and justify her complete neglect. Now she was using it on national television to paint me as a deranged, bitter woman holding a lifelong grudge. Preston chimed in, looking appropriately devastated in a cheap, ill-fitting suit he must have purchased specifically for the occasion. I just wanted to build a legacy for our family. Preston lied smoothly to the sympathetic interviewer. My sister bought my commercial debt in secret and liquidated my life's work overnight. She threw hundreds of my loyal employees onto the street just to get back at me for being the son our parents actually understood. I offered to make peace, but she refused to even speak to me. Charles finished the performance by looking directly into the camera, placing his hand over his heart to emphasize his supposed frailty. We are begging you, Jasmine. Please stop this corporate bullying. We are old and sick, and you are making us homeless. We just want our family to be whole again. Victoria paused her writing and looked at me, her expression clinically detached. This is textbook defamation, Jasmine, she stated, tapping her pen against the legal pad. They are actively damaging the Vanguard equity brand with these televised lies. We can file an emergency injunction by midnight and force the network to issue a retraction. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the frozen image of my weeping mother on the screen. No, Victoria, I said, my voice perfectly calm. Let them have the spotlight tonight. Let them convince the entire world that they are innocent, helpless victims of a billionaire tyrant. The higher they build this public pedestal, the harder the concrete will feel when I rip the foundation out from under them. Prepare the digital documentation, I requested. We are going to let them walk right into their own public execution. The fallout from the primetime interview was immediate and intensely aggressive. By the next morning, the sidewalk outside my corporate headquarters was swarming with reporters, photographers, and angry protesters. People were holding crude cardboard signs accusing me of elder abuse and corporate greed. The outrage machine had been fully activated, and my family was trending across the globe as tragic martyrs. My security team had to form a physical barricade just to clear a safe path for my vehicle. I stepped out of the bulletproof sedan, wearing a sharp white tailored suit. I did not wear sunglasses to hide my face. I did not duck my head or rush toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who owned the pavement beneath her feet. I wanted them to see my face. I wanted them to see that I was entirely unbothered by their manufactured outrage. Before my guards could fully secure the perimeter, a highly aggressive journalist broke through the security line. I recognized him immediately. He was a notorious shock reporter from a major cable news network known for ambushing corporate executives on live television. He had a cameraman trailing right behind him, a red light glowing brightly to indicate they were broadcasting a live feed to millions of morning viewers. The journalist shoved a heavy microphone directly into my face, physically blocking my path to the building entrance. Jasmine, he shouted, his voice echoing loudly over the chaotic noise of the angry crowd. How do you justify bankrupting your own brother? Do you have any comment on the severe allegations of elder abuse? You are a billionaire sitting in a glass tower while your sick elderly parents are facing imminent homelessness because of your ruthless corporate bullying. Do you feel any remorse for destroying your family out of petty childhood jealousy? My security detail immediately moved forward to physically remove the reporter. My head of security reached out to grab the camera lens and push the man back behind the barricade. I simply raised my right hand. The gesture was small but carried absolute authority. My guards instantly stopped and stepped back, giving me a clear, unobstructed view of the aggressive journalist and the glowing red recording light of his camera. The reporter looked momentarily confused by my compliance. He thought he had cornered a panicked executive. He expected me to shield my face or shout no comment while running frantically into the safety of the lobby. He did not expect me to stand perfectly still and look at him with a gaze so cold it could freeze water. You are broadcasting live right now, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and relaxed. The journalist puffed out his chest, sensing a viral television moment that would secure his career. Yes, we are live right now, he confirmed, pushing the microphone closer to my mouth. The entire country is watching you, Jasmine. What do you have to say to your parents who are begging you on national television to stop this ruthless behavior? How do you sleep at night knowing you are destroying the people who raised you? I turned my head slightly, shifting my gaze from the arrogant reporter to look directly into the dark lens of the live camera. I made sure every single viewer sitting in their living room felt like I was speaking directly to them. I stood tall, the pristine white of my suit contrasting sharply against the chaotic mob surrounding me. I have scheduled an official press conference for 8 in the morning tomorrow, I announced, my voice carrying effortlessly over the ambient noise of the street. I will not be answering questions from ambush reporters, but I will be releasing a comprehensive digital dossier to every major news outlet in this country. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the sudden quiet of the crowd. The protesters had stopped chanting to listen to my response. The dossier will contain the unedited high-definition security footage of my family illegally breaking into my penthouse to extort me for $5 million. I stated clearly, making sure my enunciation was flawless. It will contain the verified federal court records of their recent arrest for felony forgery. And most importantly, It will contain the certified banking receipts, proving that they stole my $150,000 college fund when I was a minor child, before throwing me onto the street with absolutely nothing. The aggressive journalist physically stumbled backward, as if I had struck him across the face. He lowered the microphone, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The protesters behind him lowered their cardboard signs as the magnitude of my statement registered in their minds. The narrative they had been fed just hours ago was disintegrating right in front of them. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on the camera lens, projecting pure absolute dominance. My family wants to play the victim on national television. I continued, my voice sliced through the crisp morning air like a scalpel. Tomorrow morning, I am going to show you exactly what kind of monsters they truly are. I highly expect to see you all there. I turned away from the stunned reporter and walked smoothly through the revolving glass doors of my building. My security team closed in behind me, sealing the entrance and blocking the media from following. Glancing back through the thick reinforced glass, I saw the journalist staring blankly at his cameraman, completely at a loss for words. The live broadcast cut out abruptly right on his shocked, speechless face. The trap was set, and my family had absolutely no idea that their public execution was less than 24 hours away. The 8 in the morning press conference was a masterclass in absolute destruction. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional pleas to the dozens of reporters packed into my corporate media room. I simply pressed a button and projected the raw, high-definition security footage from my penthouse onto a massive screen. The entire country watched Preston violently smash my computer monitors. They watched Beatrice scream her confession about stealing my college fund to buy her golden child a business. They listened in dead silence as Charles outlined his exact strategy to launch a fake smear campaign regarding my mental health. I followed the video with projected copies of the federal arrest warrants, the Swiss ink analysis proving their forgery, and the 20-year-old bank transfer receipts documenting their theft of a minor's inheritance. The public execution was flawless. The backlash was instantaneous and entirely merciless. The very same news networks that had painted them as tragic victims the night before immediately pivoted to calling them the most despicable frauds of the decade. The hashtag supporting them vanished, replaced by a tidal wave of global disgust. Their high-priced public relations firm dropped them within an hour. The country club revoked their memberships by noon. Their few remaining wealthy friends blocked their numbers, terrified of being associated with federal criminals. In a single morning, my family went from respected socialites to absolute societal pariahs. They were completely radioactive. 2 nights later, I attended the annual Global Women in Commerce Gala at the Waldorf Astoria. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaotic media circus. This was a room filled with the most powerful, intelligent, and ruthless business leaders in the world. I wore a custom-tailored sapphire gown that swept across the floor as I navigated the ballroom. People did not just look at me with respect, they looked at me with a profound sense of awe. I had not just survived a vicious public assassination attempt by my own blood. I had clinically dismantled it and emerged entirely unscathed. The highlight of the evening was the presentation of the Entrepreneur of the Decade Award. It was a highly coveted honor, recognizing not just financial success, but sheer industry dominance. When the presenter called my name, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Hundreds of powerful executives rose to their feet, applauding as I walked up the velvet-lined stairs to the main stage. I stepped up to the crystal podium, looking out over the sea of smiling faces. It was the exact validation my parents had spent my entire childhood telling me I would never achieve. I adjusted the microphone and took a slow breath, preparing to deliver my acceptance speech. But before I could speak a single word, a violent crash echoed from the back of the grand ballroom. The heavy gilded doors were thrown open with such force that one of them slammed loudly against the wood-paneled wall. A collective gasp rippled through the elegant crowd as the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Standing in the doorway, panting heavily and looking entirely feral, was my brother Preston. I was completely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant man who had tried to extort me just days ago. His expensive tuxedo jacket was missing. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, covered in dark stains and wrinkling wildly. He reeked of cheap alcohol and stale sweat. His hair was matted to his forehead, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, and manic. Right behind him, looking equally unhinged, were Charles and Beatrice. They had clearly bypassed the main security checkpoint by slipping through the hotel kitchen or bribing a catering staff member. Beatrice was wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair a tangled mess. Charles looked like a cornered animal, his face pale and shining with a sickly, nervous sweat. They were facing imminent federal prison sentences, massive financial restitution, and total social exile. They had absolutely nothing left to lose. Preston let out a guttural, enraged scream and began to storm down the center aisle of the ballroom. He shoved past tables of horrified executives, knocking over crystal wine glasses and expensive floral centerpieces. Security guards immediately rushed forward from the side exits, reaching for their radios and moving to intercept the three intruders. The head of event security placed a firm hand on Preston's shoulder, preparing to tackle him to the floor. I leaned forward into the microphone. "Stand down," I instructed the security team, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive sound system. "Let him approach." The guards hesitated, looking up at me on the stage. I gave them a sharp, definitive nod. They stepped back, allowing Preston to continue his frantic, drunken march toward the stage. I did not want him dragged out quietly in the shadows. I wanted every single powerful person in this room to witness exactly what kind of pathetic, broken men had tried to destroy me. I wanted my family to dig their own grave in front of the most influential audience on the planet. Preston scrambled up the stairs to the stage, tripping over his own feet and scraping his knee against the velvet carpet. He stumbled toward the crystal podium, his breathing ragged and heavy with the stench of liquor. He lunged forward and violently snatched the microphone directly off the stand. The speakers let out a loud, piercing screech of feedback that made several guests in the front row cover their ears. "You think you are so special," Preston screamed into the microphone, his voice slurred and dripping with absolute venom. He swayed on his feet, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You think standing up here in a fancy dress makes you a titan. You think destroying your own flesh and blood makes you a hero." I remained perfectly still, letting him broadcast his pathetic breakdown to the entire room. "You are nothing," Preston roared, spitting the words through the microphone. "You are the exact same hideous, useless little freak you were 20 years ago. You were an ugly, antisocial loser who sat in her bedroom talking to computers because no one in the real world could stand to look at your face. You were a total embarrassment to this family. We were ashamed to even call you our sister." Beatrice reached the bottom of the stage stairs, clapping her hands and shouting in agreement. "Tell them, Preston," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "Tell all these people the truth about what a cruel, unnatural monster she really is. She set us up. She manipulated the media to steal everything from us." Preston gripped the microphone with both hands, leaning in so close to me I could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes. "You are a freak, Jasmine. You always were and you always will be. You can buy all the expensive companies in the world, but you cannot buy a soul. You ruined my life. You stole my logistics company. You took my dignity. My wife left me this morning because of the lies you spread. You took everything from me out of pure, ugly jealousy." The ballroom was dead silent. Hundreds of highly influential executives watched in stunned horror as a grown man threw a drunken, violent temper tantrum on a prestigious award stage. They were witnessing the absolute collapse of a human being. I looked at Preston. I looked at the sweat dripping down his face and the desperate, wild panic in his eyes. He had lost his business, his wife, his wealth, and his freedom. The only weapon he had left in his entire arsenal was calling me ugly. It was the exact same insult he had used to terrorize a 13-year-old girl. But I was not a scared child anymore. I was a corporate predator standing at the absolute apex of my power. I reached out and calmly took the microphone back from his trembling hands. He was so physically and emotionally exhausted that he did not even try to fight me for it. He just stood there, swaying, breathing heavily, and waiting for me to shatter into tears. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I turned my back on my brother, completely dismissing his existence, and looked out at the silent, watching audience. "I apologize for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice perfectly modulated and smooth. But I suppose this is actually a rather fitting introduction to my acceptance speech. I turned back to look at my brother and my parents, who were standing at the base of the stage, looking suddenly very small and very confused. You see, I continued, projecting my voice effortlessly across the grand ballroom. The man standing behind me, currently reeking of gin and desperation, is my older brother. The people at the bottom of the stairs are my biological parents. And 20 years ago, they did not just call me ugly and useless. They threw me out onto the street with exactly $200 in my pocket because I was not pretty enough or compliant enough to fit into their shallow country club mold. They told me I would die a failure. They told me I would never amount to anything without their grace and their charity. The audience sat in rapt attention. The silence in the room was so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I let the weight of my history hang in the air, allowing the truth of their abuse to completely saturate the elegant space. They stole my college inheritance to fund the very business this man just bankrupted, I stated clearly, pointing a single manicured finger at Preston. They forged legal documents and attempted to extort me for millions of dollars just days ago. And when their criminal enterprise failed, they came here tonight to try and humiliate me with the exact same playground insults they used when I was a defenseless child. Preston opened his mouth to shout another insult, but the words died in his throat. He looked out at the crowd of executives. He did not see sympathy or agreement. He saw hundreds of powerful, successful people looking at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The realization that his public ambush had completely backfired began to sink in. He had not exposed me as a monster. He had permanently branded himself as a pathetic abuser in front of the entire corporate world. Charles, realizing the catastrophic error they had made, tried to scramble up the velvet-lined stairs to reach the stage. He shoved past Beatrice, his face twisted into a mask of pure panic and rage. "Shut your mouth, Jasmine!" Charles bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain of his own terror. "You are airing family business in public. You are destroying the family name. We built you. We gave you life. You will pay for humiliating us in front of these people. I will personally make sure you lose everything." He lunged toward the podium, reaching out violently to grab my arm and drag me away from the microphone. He wanted to physically force me into submission, just like he had always done. But he never even made it past the top step. Two of my personal security agents materialized from the shadows of the stage wings, moving with terrifying speed. Before my father's outstretched hand could even graze the fabric of my sapphire gown, they intercepted him. One guard grabbed Charles by the shoulder, while the other swept his legs out from under him. My father hit the stage with a heavy, breathless thud. They pinned him face down against the plush velvet carpet, forcing his arms behind his back with practiced clinical efficiency. Preston, who was still standing near the podium, completely froze. The drunken rage that had fueled his initial charge evaporated the moment he saw our father taken down so effortlessly. He dropped his arms to his sides, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the security guards. Down at the base of the stairs, Beatrice let out a piercing, theatrical shriek. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly and begging someone in the audience to help her husband. Nobody moved to help them. The hundreds of influential executives, billionaires, and industry titans sitting at the banquet tables simply watched in absolute disgust. They were looking at a family of exposed frauds staging a violent temper tantrum at one of the most prestigious corporate events of the year. I looked down at Charles. He was gasping for air, his expensive tuxedo jacket twisting awkwardly around his shoulders. His face was pressed hard into the floorboards, but his eyes still burned with that same arrogant, unyielding hatred he had directed at me my entire life. Even now, pinned to the ground by my security team, he truly believed he was the authority figure, and I was just the disobedient child who needed to be punished. I turned my attention away from his pathetic struggle and stepped back up to the crystal podium. I adjusted the microphone slightly. The grand ballroom was so incredibly silent that you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses on the tables. I looked out over the sea of powerful faces, making sure to maintain absolute perfect composure. 20 years ago, I began, my voice echoing with sharp clarity across the massive room. My family threw me out of their house with exactly $200 in my pocket. They did this not because I had done something wrong, but because I was not pretty enough or compliant enough to fit into their shallow country club mold. I was a 13-year-old girl who preferred advanced mathematics to beauty pageants, and to them that made me a defect. I paused, letting the heavy reality of my words sink into the minds of the audience. Several prominent executives in the front row shook their heads in silent revulsion, casting glaring looks at Beatrice, who was still weeping at the bottom of the stairs. They packed my bags on the night of my high school graduation. I continued keeping my tone entirely factual and devoid of self-pity. They shoved me out the front door into the dark and told me I would die a failure. They told me I was useless, ugly, and entirely unworthy of their love or their resources. They stole my college inheritance to fund the very business this man next to me just ran into the ground. They expected me to vanish into obscurity and starve. I gestured gracefully to the glittering ballroom around me, the stunning floral arrangements, the crystal chandeliers, and the rows of successful professionals who had just given me a standing ovation. But I did not starve, I stated, my voice radiating absolute power. I survived. I built Vanguard equity from nothing. I turned myself into a woman who commands global markets, while the people who discarded me resorted to felony forgery and corporate blackmail just to maintain the illusion of their wealth. Charles began to thrash violently against the grip of the security guards. The public exposure of his darkest sins was too much for his massive, fragile ego to bear. He twisted his neck, trying to look up at me from the floor, his face purple with furious exertion. "You have permanently destroyed the family name." Charles screamed, his voice hoarse and cracking with desperation. He spat the words out as if they were poison. "You are a complete disgrace to our bloodline, Jasmine. You orchestrated this entire circus just to humiliate us in front of the city elite. I will make you pay for this. You think you can stand up there and ruin generations of our respectable social standing without consequences. I will destroy your reputation. I will make sure you never work in this town again once I am through with you." His threats were so completely detached from reality that I actually felt a brief, fleeting wave of pity for his delusion. He was a bankrupt criminal lying pinned to the floor of a hotel ballroom, yet he still believed he held the power to destroy me. He still thought his country club reputation meant something in a room full of people who actually controlled the global economy. I looked down at my father, letting a cold, detached smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I did not destroy our family name." "Charles," I said softly, my voice carrying perfectly through the microphone, "I bought it." I raised my left hand and signaled the audiovisual technicians stationed in the production booth at the back of the ballroom. Instantly, the massive high-definition digital screen behind me shifted. The glowing gold logo of the Global Women in Commerce Gala vanished. In its place, a highly magnified, sharply focused legal document appeared on the screen for every single person in the room to read. The document was stamped with the official seal of the Primary Commercial Bank of Chicago. It was a formal deed of sale and a notice of immediate eviction. Preston squinted at the massive screen, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to process the legal terminology. Beatrice stopped crying and stared up at the projection, her hands slowly dropping to her sides as the color drained completely out of her face. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, your sprawling family estate was officially foreclosed on," I announced, breaking the stunned silence of the room. "When you defaulted on the massive secondary loans you took out to fund Preston's failing logistics company, the bank immediately moved to seize your assets. The property went to a private banking auction 3 hours ago." I turned my head and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "I bought it, Charles," I stated, my words falling like heavy, precise blows. "I purchased the estate, the property, and the surrounding acreage in a cash transaction. The deed was officially transferred to my holding company before you even managed to sneak your way into this hotel tonight." Charles stopped struggling against the guards. His entire body went completely limp against the stage floor. The reality of his absolute ruin finally broke through the thick layer of his narcissistic delusion. "You are currently trespassing in my city." I continued, showing absolutely no mercy to the people who had shown me none. "And more importantly, you have no home to return to tonight. My private asset management team is at the estate right now. They have already changed the locks, deactivated your security codes, and boxed up your personal belongings. Whatever clothes you are currently wearing are the only possessions you have access to. You are officially homeless. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing wail, collapsing onto the bottom step of the stage. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, rocking back and forth as the catastrophic reality of her new life crashed down upon her. She had spent decades judging people based on their wealth and social standing, and now she possessed neither. She was entirely destitute. Preston fell to his knees on the stage, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob loudly, the sound echoing pathetically through the microphone, still picking up the ambient noise. He had lost his company, his wife, his inheritance, and now the very roof over his head, all in the span of less than a week. I looked out at the audience of powerful executives. They were watching the absolute dismantling of my abusers with silent, intense fascination. They were witnessing what happens when you attempt to hunt a predator and realize too late that you are actually the prey. I stepped away from the podium and looked down at my family one last time. They were broken, weeping, and entirely powerless. The long shadows they had cast over my childhood had been completely burned away by the harsh, blinding light of the truth. Security, I instructed, my voice calm and professional. Please escort these trespassers off the premises. Hand them over to the local authorities waiting in the lobby. They have active federal warrants for their arrest, and I believe the police are very eager to speak with them regarding their ongoing fraud investigations. The security guards hauled Charles to his feet, gripping his arms tightly. Two more guards rushed up the stairs to grab Preston, dragging him up from his knees. A female security officer gently but firmly took hold of Beatrice at the bottom of the stairs, guiding her toward the exit. As they were being marched down the center aisle of the ballroom, the audience did not look away. The elite guests watched them with expressions of cold, unforgiving judgment. My family was paraded out of the gala in absolute disgrace, their false legacy entirely reduced to ashes. I stood on the stage, bathed in the bright, warm light of the chandeliers, finally breathing the clean, crisp air of total vindication. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the wet asphalt outside the Waldorf Astoria, casting long, jagged shadows across the faces of my family. The elite guests of the gala did not return to their tables immediately. Instead, they crowded near the towering glass windows of the lobby, watching with grim satisfaction as the once proud architectural pillars of Chicago high society were forcefully shoved into the back of standard-issue squad cars. Preston fought against the heavy metal handcuffs biting into his wrists, shouting slurred threats at the arresting officers, until a detective firmly pushed his head down and slammed the cruiser door shut. Beatrice wept hysterically on the curb, her ruined designer gown dragging through a muddy puddle as a female officer read her the Miranda rights. Charles simply stared blankly ahead, completely catatonic, as the cold reality of federal custody finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his lifelong narcissistic delusion. I watched the police caravan pull away from the curb and merge into the busy city traffic. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, feeling a profound sense of weightlessness. The heavy, suffocating chains they had wrapped around my neck 20 years ago were finally permanently broken. The following week was a masterclass in absolute systemic destruction. The legal and financial consequences of their actions crashed down upon them with the unstoppable force of a concrete avalanche. With their corrupt attorney already sitting in a federal holding cell and offering full cooperation to the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence, my family was left entirely defenseless. The federal prosecutors moved with terrifying speed. Because they had utilized interstate banking lines to commit their original theft of my college fund and then attempted to use the federal court system to extort a public corporate entity, the charges were elevated to severe federal crimes. Their bail was revoked when prosecutors proved they posed a significant flight risk due to their massive outstanding debts. They spent 4 agonizing days sitting in a cold concrete holding cell before a judge finally granted them a temporary release pending trial, provided they surrendered their passports and submitted to ankle monitors. But the criminal charges were only a fraction of their punishment. The financial ruin was absolute and entirely merciless. The commercial bank I controlled executed the final eviction orders on the family estate with brutal efficiency. When Charles and Beatrice were released from holding, they attempted to return to their sprawling mansion, only to find a heavy iron padlock on the main gates and two armed private security contractors standing in the driveway. The bank seized every single asset housed within the property to offset the massive defaulted loans Charles had co-signed for Preston. The luxury vehicles, the expensive imported furniture, the original oil paintings, and even Beatrice's extensive collection of diamond jewelry were loaded into moving trucks and catalogued for immediate auction. Preston experienced an even steeper drop into the abyss. His logistics company was officially dissolved and sold off in pieces to pay his creditors. He was left with millions of dollars in personal liability. Diana, his fiercely arrogant wife, who had sprinted out of the boardroom days earlier, screaming about a divorce lawyer, quickly discovered that she could not outrun the blast radius of her husband's failure. Because she had eagerly co-signed several of his fraudulent secondary loans to fund her lavish shopping habits, the federal asset freeze extended directly to her private accounts. Her attempts to empty her safety deposit boxes and flee the state were intercepted by federal agents. She was grounded, entirely broke, and legally shackled to the very man she had tried to abandon. They were stripped of their wealth, their home, their credit, and their social standing in a matter of 7 days. They went from dining at Michelin-star restaurants to pooling the crumpled cash from their pockets just to afford a single room at a dingy roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. They had no friends left to call. Every single person in their wealthy social circle had blocked their numbers, terrified of the radioactive fallout of associating with exposed federal criminals. By Tuesday afternoon, the heavy gray clouds over Manhattan finally broke, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour that flooded the city streets. I was sitting in the warm, quiet sanctuary of my executive office on the top floor of Vanguard Equity, finalizing a massive international merger. The rhythmic sound of the heavy rain beating against the reinforced glass windows was incredibly peaceful. My desk phone chimed softly. It was the head of building security stationed down in the main lobby. "Ms. Jasmine," my security director said, his voice carrying a tone of deep professional concern. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation outside the main entrance. Your family is here." I did not flinch. I kept my eyes focused on the legal contract in front of me. "Are they attempting to bypass the security perimeter again?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. "No, ma'am," the security director replied. "They are not trying to enter the building. They are just standing out on the concrete plaza. It is pouring rain out there, and they are completely soaked. I offered to call the local authorities to have them removed for loitering, but they are begging to speak with you. They say they have absolutely nowhere else to go." I remained silent for a long moment, considering my options. I could easily instruct security to chase them away. I could leave them standing in the freezing rain to rot. But walking away without a final confrontation felt incomplete. They needed to understand exactly where the power dynamic had permanently settled. They needed to look me in the eye and recognize that the universe does not reward cruelty with salvation. "Tell the front desk to hold my car in the private loading bay," I instructed, closing the file on my desk. "I will be coming down to the plaza." I took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. When the polished steel doors parted, the expansive glass-walled lobby was buzzing with security personnel. 2 of my personal bodyguards immediately flanked me, holding large, reinforced black umbrellas. I walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped out into the freezing torrential downpour. The scene waiting for me on the concrete plaza was almost surreal. The towering, sleek glass facade of my corporate headquarters loomed above us, representing billions of dollars in global power. And standing in the shadow of that massive empire, looking like drowned, pathetic rats, were the 4 people who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was worthless. Charles, Beatrice, Preston, and Diana were shivering violently in the freezing rain. Their appearance was a shocking testament to their rapid total ruin. They were no longer wearing custom-tailored suits or designer silk gowns. They were wearing cheap, ill-fitting sweatpants and thin jackets they had clearly purchased from a discount clearance rack. Their hair was plastered to their faces by the relentless rain, and their cheap shoes were completely soaked through by the deep puddles forming on the concrete. The moment they saw me step out from under the glass awning, protected by the large black umbrellas held by my guards, the last remaining shred of their arrogant pride completely evaporated. Preston was the first to break. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed forward, dropping heavily to his knees right in the middle of a massive freezing puddle. The dirty rainwater splashed up against his cheap sweatpants, but he did not seem to care. He looked up at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure absolute agony. Water streamed down his cheeks, mixing heavily with his tears. "Jasmine, please," Preston sobbed, his voice cracking and echoing pathetically over the sound of the heavy rain. "Please, you have to help us. We have absolutely nothing left. The motel kicked us out this morning because Diana's credit card was finally declined. We have not eaten a real meal in 2 days. I am begging you. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Please do not leave us out here to die." Beatrice fell to her knees right next to her golden child. She did not care about her ruined hair or the dirty concrete scraping against her skin. The vicious, snobby socialite, who had commanded country club galas just a week prior, was now a weeping, shivering mess, groveling at the feet of the daughter she had thrown away. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my pristine designer coat, but my security guards instantly stepped forward, blocking her reach. "You are our daughter!" Beatrice wailed, her voice shrill and completely broken by the freezing wind. "You cannot leave your own family on the street. We made a terrible mistake. We were wrong about you. We were so incredibly wrong. Please, Jasmine, we are sorry. We are so incredibly sorry for everything we did. Just give us a tiny loan. We just need enough money to rent a small apartment on the edge of the city. Just enough to buy groceries so we do not starve. Please show us some mercy." I looked down at my mother. I looked at the rain washing away the last traces of her false superiority. I looked at Diana, who was standing behind them, hugging herself and shivering uncontrollably, her eyes wide with desperate pleading fear. And finally, I looked at Charles. The great authoritative patriarch who had threatened to destroy my reputation was now slowly lowering himself down onto the wet concrete, joining his wife and son in the mud. He bowed his head, unable to even meet my gaze, entirely broken by his own spectacular failure. I stood perfectly still under the shelter of the black umbrella. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a rush of warmth or a sudden urge to forgive the people who had tortured me for 13 years and then attempted to steal my hard-earned empire. I felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical justice. "You stand here begging for a small apartment," I said, my voice slicing through the sound of the pouring rain with absolute terrifying clarity. "You beg for a warm bed and a grocery budget. You cry about being cold and hungry for 2 days. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to them, looking directly down into Beatrice's weeping eyes. "Where was this mercy 20 years ago?" I asked the question, hanging heavily in the freezing air. "Where was this desperate need for family support when you packed my bags on the night of my high school graduation? You threw a 13-year-old girl out into the dark. You did not care if I froze. You did not care if I starved. You took the very money meant to secure my future, and you handed it to the man currently weeping in a puddle at my feet." Beatrice sobbed harder, clutching her hands to her chest. "We were blind," she cried. "We were stupid and blind." "No," I corrected her sharply. "You were cruel. You were deeply intentionally cruel because you thought I was too weak to ever fight back. You thought you could discard me like trash and face absolutely no consequences. But you were wrong." I looked at the four of them shivering on the wet pavement, completely stripped of their wealth, their home, and their dignity. "I survived the street," I stated, projecting my voice so they would hear every single word over the storm. "I survived the cold and the hunger, and I built an empire that you could not even begin to comprehend. I won the war you started, and now it is your turn to see exactly how hard the concrete really is." Beatrice lets out a ragged scream that tears through the heavy sound of the falling rain. She throws her body forward, completely ignoring the massive security guards standing on either side of me. Her wet hands grasp desperately at the fabric of my custom trench coat. Her fingernails dig into the expensive material as she tries to pull herself up from the freezing puddle. The sheer desperation in her eyes is something I have never witnessed before. She is a woman who spent her entire life judging the less fortunate, and now she is begging for her life on a public sidewalk. "You are our daughter," Beatrice cries, her voice breaking under the weight of her own panic. You are our own flesh and blood. You cannot leave us out here on the street. We will freeze. We will not survive out here, Jasmine. Please, you have to forgive us. You have to take us in. We are your family. I do not pull away immediately. I stand perfectly still under the shelter of the black umbrella and look down at the woman who gave birth to me. I feel no anger. I feel no lingering resentment or sadness. I feel an overwhelming sense of profound serenity. The detachment washing over me is incredibly liberating. I look at her dripping wet hair and her trembling hands, and I see exactly what she is. She is just a pathetic bully who finally ran out of victims. I reach down and calmly peel her fingers off my coat one by one. I step back, placing an insurmountable distance between us. You left a 13-year-old girl on the street because she was not good for your image. I say, my voice, steady and completely void of any emotion. You locked the door of your massive mansion and went to sleep in your warm bed while I sat at a bus stop terrified and alone. I survived. Now it is your turn. Beatrice drops her face into her hands, weeping so violently that her shoulders shake with the force of her sobs. Charles does not even try to comfort her. He is staring blankly at the wet pavement, completely destroyed by the realization that his authoritative power has permanently vanished. He is a king without a kingdom, and the silence coming from him is the loudest admission of defeat I could ever ask for. But Preston is not done. The golden boy who had everything handed to him on a silver platter cannot accept that his safety net has been completely incinerated. He drags himself across the wet concrete, his knees scraping against the rough ground. He ignores his weeping mother and his catatonic father. He looks up at me with eyes full of desperate, pathetic hope. Jasmine, please, Preston begs, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Diana left me. She filed the divorce papers this morning because of the asset freeze. She took whatever cash she had hidden away in her private accounts and abandoned me at the motel. I have absolutely nothing left. My company is gone. My wife is gone. My friends will not even answer my text messages. I am completely ruined. I look down at my older brother. This is the man who snapped my bidding paddle at the charity gala just a few days ago. This is the man who destroyed my office equipment and threatened to ruin my reputation on national television. Now he is kneeling in the mud wearing discount sweatpants and begging for a lifeline from the very sister he tried to destroy. I know you hate me. Preston continues, the rain washing over his face and plastering his hair to his forehead. I know I was terrible to you. I was a horrible brother. But I am asking for mercy. Just a small loan, Jasmine. That is all I need. Just a fraction of what you make in a single day to get a small apartment and start over. I will pay you back every single cent. I swear on my life I will pay you back. Just give me a chance to get back on my feet. I stand in the pouring rain, letting his pathetic pleas echo across the plaza. I watch the desperate anticipation burning in his eyes. He is looking at me the way a starving dog looks at a scrap of meat. Even now, after everything he has done, he still believes his title as my brother entitles him to my resources. He believes that if he grovels low enough, the wealthy, successful sister will simply write a check to make the problem go away. He thinks this is just a transaction. I slowly reach into my designer handbag. The simple movement causes a visible ripple of electricity to shoot through my ruined family. Preston's eyes light up with immediate, desperate hope. Beatrice lifts her head from her hand, her weeping pausing for a fraction of a second as she watches my hand disappear into the leather bag. Even Charles shifts his gaze upward, a tiny spark of salvation igniting in his defeated, hollow eyes. They truly believe I'm about to pull out a checkbook. They think the nightmare is finally over. I do not pull out a checkbook. I pull out my tailored leather wallet. I open it with deliberate, agonizing slowness, making sure they watch my every movement. I reach into the cash compartment and I pull out two crisp new $100 bills. I hold the currency between my fingers, letting the green paper flutter slightly in the cold wind. Preston's eyes track the money with a sickening level of greed. He reaches his shaking hands upward, expecting me to hand the bills down to him. He thinks this is the beginning of his rescue. He thinks he has successfully manipulated my conscience. I look him dead in the eye. I slowly open my fingers and let the money go. The two crisp bills flutter down through the heavy rain. They land directly in the muddy, freezing puddle right at Preston's knees. The dirty water immediately soaks into the paper, ruining the pristine green currency. "Here is $200, I announce, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a closing door. "It is exactly what you gave me 20 years ago. Let us see how far you get." Preston's mouth drops open in sheer horror. The desperate hope in his eyes shatters, completely replaced by the crushing, suffocating reality of his total doom. He stares down at the wet, dirty money floating in the mud. He realizes in that exact moment that I am not saving him. I am not offering him a second chance. I am simply giving him the exact same agonizing starting line they forced upon me 2 decades ago. Beatrice lets out a fresh, horrifying wail, burying her face against Charles' shoulder. Charles just closes his eyes, unable to look at the money or at me. They are finally completely broken. The generational cycle of their abuse has been dismantled brick by brick, and their toxic legacy ends right here in the freezing rain on the streets of Manhattan. They have no money, no power, and no one left to blame but themselves. I do not wait to see if Preston picks up the money from the mud. I do not care what they do next. Their future is no longer my concern. Their lives have been entirely severed from mine. I turn my back on them for the very last time. My security guards move with me, keeping the heavy black umbrellas positioned perfectly over my head to shield me from the storm. I walk gracefully toward the edge of the plaza, where my personal driver is waiting by the curb. He has the rear door of my luxury armored sedan held wide open. The warm golden light from the interior of the vehicle spills out onto the wet pavement, offering a stark contrast to the freezing darkness of the street. I step into the back of the car, sinking into the heated leather seats. The driver closes the heavy door with a solid, comforting thud, instantly cutting off the sound of the pouring rain and the pathetic weeping of the strangers kneeling on the concrete outside. The interior of the car is perfectly silent. The air smells of expensive leather and quiet success. My lead security director gets into the front passenger seat and gives the driver a quick nod. The powerful engine purrs to life, and the vehicle pulls smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the chaotic flow of the city traffic. I do not look out the tinted rear window as we drive away. I do not need to see them shrinking in the rearview mirror to know they are gone. I sit back against the plush headrest and close my eyes, listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the windshield wipers. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace settles deep into my bones. The angry, terrified 13-year-old girl who spent 2 decades fighting to prove her worth has finally been laid to rest. She does not need to fight anymore. She does not need to prove anything to anyone. The war is officially over and the battlefield has been swept entirely clean. I open my eyes and look forward at the bright neon lights of the city glowing through the rain-slicked windshield. I am 33 years old. I am the sole architect of my own destiny. I built an empire from the ashes of my childhood, and I emerged from the fire completely victorious. I am